Hello, overachievers. I am so excited to get into our session today. We have an absolute trailblazer amongst us, Amma Hooks, who some of you may know as that inclusion lady. Quick funny story. So, Amma and I actually connected over social media, which I think is the beauty of the times that we're living in. When I first started the Overachievers, I was so hungry to get my hands on any content that was going to help inform me and my audience around the importance of DEI, the nuances, and understanding more of the what, why, and how. And Ama's content is so well done. It's very digestible. And when you're talking about some really challenging topics, it's important to do so in a way where all types of audiences can be heard. And I think Amma does an absolutely amazing job at that. So I'm really excited to have her here today. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Amma. So, Amma, can you tell everyone a little bit about you and your background and how you got into your work as a professional troublemaker?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ash. And oh my gosh, what you said is just so humbling. Um,
It's so
so
good.
how did I get into this? I will say it really initially started when growing up in Miami, right? Like, so I just always been aware of different cultures, how it makes people tick, how people are different than me, and you learn to just have an appreciation for it. But I formalized that appreciation by getting my master's in business, but focusing in global management. So that was my entryway into inclusion to really understand cross cultural communication, how it impacts business, how people look at financial industries differently, and all of that. So that was my entryway to formalize my passion for inclusion. And then I was recruited straight out of there to work for a Fortune 50 organization where I was able to then start managing people. And from trials and mistakes and also some wins, I really learned to hone in on my superpower, which is connecting with people and connecting the business case to the human case, and improve turnover and improved, margins and all of those things. So that was my start into becoming that inclusion lady.
Yeah, it's so important. It's so funny too. Like, I feel when the average person thinks about HR teams or inclusion, you're not usually thinking about the business case behind it. It feels like, okay, it's maybe a tokenistic thing or it's like a box we're checking, but there's so much data out there that actually points to how this makes business sense. And am I correct in understanding that your business background is a unique entryway into all things inclusion?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, I am not the biggest fan of saying, here's the business case for having diversity, right? That feels a bit tokenistic. It
Yeah.
feels a bit exploitative, actually. Like you hire this one Black person and you improve your revenue by 5%, right? Like it just does
Yeah,
not sit well with me.
terrible.
However, I can definitely speak to and feel really comfortable with there is a dollar amount attached to how your people feel and operate within an organization. And if you don't care, it is going to impact things like margins, things like customer satisfaction, even things like, how you spend on your team and competitive advantage and competitive edge and market share and all of those things. So I initially start with data and I lead with passion and stories and anecdotes because it's just how both of my brains work. Again, like you said, having that business background, you can definitely you can put a money amount, you can monetize emotion essentially.
Yeah,
Being
absolutely.
happy at work is not just a like a
Yeah, people
feel
want to know
good.
that there is an ROI on the investment they're
Yes,
making in their
absolutely.
people, which is so interesting. And we were talking about when you're first engaging with an organization, right? There's so many companies that know that they need to be making some efforts at improving working conditions and making equitable environments for all types of different backgrounds. Where do you usually recommend someone begins? And what type of advice would you give to a decision maker if they're thinking, okay, we're going to invest and where do we begin?
Yeah, I would say assess your organization.
Yeah.
I always say start with an assessment because it's going to give you quantitative and qualitative data.
Yeah.
What I often see is that the C suite is experiencing the organization in one way,
Yeah.
and the employees are experiencing the organization in a different way. And oftentimes there's a disconnect. So look at an assessment and ask intentional questions, questions that provide an opportunity for someone to share their experience, but also questions to provide opportunity for you to understand the lived experience at your organization through different identities, as well as through various aspects of your organization. And so that is the starting point. See where you are, do a pulse check, get data
Yeah.
first, and then come together to say, okay, what do we need to prioritize and ruthlessly prioritize, because sometimes we can get overwhelmed of wanting to fix everything
Yeah.
quickly. And this is not a quickly, this is a game. This is a long game.
It's a long play for sure. And I remember you had said that, which was what I loved. Like my background has been in tech and like speaking in terms of data is everything because that is how you should determine prioritization. We might think that there's like five different focus areas over here that need attention, and really there's one massive one over here that you can only really understand through asking the right questions, which is where working with external consultants, I imagine, is extremely beneficial. Is there one or two examples you can point to that you're most proud of when you look at the different engagements you've had over time and where you can see real impact being made?
Oh my goodness. Yes. So before I answer that, I just want to piggyback off of what you said. And when we're looking at these priorities, oftentimes people look at it as two separate things like, okay, diversity and inclusion. Oh, and then we have our business strategy. But I'm going to continue to compare it to like a safety initiative. When
Yeah.
we think of a safety initiative, it's not, oh, this safety initiative off to the side. It's oftentimes a part of your business strategic plan. And so that is also important when prioritizing does this fall under the business strategic plan for 3 to 5 years, and right,
Yeah.
and how do we also prioritize so it impacts other parts of the business. So having said that, and having that perspective, and with coming into an organization, I remember I was on a project and we were initially hired because of turnover, and they thought that they just needed to hire more people, so they thought they had a recruiting issue. And I'm like, okay. But again, asking more questions, looking at assessments, aggregating the data they already have, I quickly realized that they didn't have a recruiting issue. They had a retention issue, because you're recruiting over 1,000 people a year. You're doing something right
Yeah.
on that end, but those 1,000 people are also leaving. So what's the reason for that? And so at first they didn't look at this, of course, as diversity, equity, and inclusion. This was more on a HR perspective. But that's once you started peeling the layers back and looking at the data and talking to employees, you saw, no, this was an inclusion issue for sure. This was an equity issue. And what were systems we had to put in place to improve retention. And so there were a lot of systems we had to put in place, but a big focus was managerial behavior.
Yeah.
What do we need to do to change some of the behaviors that impact the day-to-day experiences of employees, where they also feel empowered to put themselves out there for promotions or development or to lead their people better and all of those things? So what was the result? We were actually able to hire the first he was Panamanian American male for leadership. They had never had anyone in
Yeah.
executive leadership that wasn't a white man. And so
Yeah.
that was one thing. But then we were also able to create the systems and structures where that person was empowered to make decisions. Because as we often see, you might have the first come to the company, but they're not able to show and showcase their talents. So we were able to do both. And that was just a really huge win. And he's still there.
I love it. Yeah, that's the
And
important piece.
yeah, he's
And
still
they
there. And
retain
he's
there.
still there.
Yeah.
And they've improved turnover tremendously. So yeah, big
Yeah.
win.
That's an amazing example. There's like so much I want to unpack in there too.
Yeah.
A couple of questions I have. We'd spoken about this before. So I've been a hiring manager in the past, and you can kind of see how within an organization, there's so many different, everyone has a different management style. Everyone has a different relation to understanding what diversity means for their team and how they can best support it. And what I really liked about what you were sharing with me prior was looking at like the policies and frameworks that are in place that may actually be detracting from the experience of Black coworkers or Latina coworkers. Could you talk to me a little bit more about that in relation to things like performance plans and how you can create more of a process that works for varying groups?
Yeah. So I'm going to take that in two different ways. One, looking at the policies, and then we're going to look at the practices, right?
Yeah.
Because those are often two different things. So when we're looking at the policies and I'm auditing your policies, I am looking at what are these policies and how are they impacting different identities. And so a perfect example would be most organizations have a bereavement policy, which is amazing, but then those organizations also go to list the family that you can take certain amount of days off for. Well, when we do that, that negatively impacts collectivistic type of communities as well as people in the LGBTQ plus community. And so when I'm looking at this, I'm saying, how can this be more equitable and inclusive for all people, but can still support the organization and what they can financially do? So that's an example of looking at policies to say, how is it impacting different lived experiences? And how does this help the company be more competitive within the next, for example, 5 years?
Yeah.
Um, Another example of that is a lot of organizations I've seen, you have to be there for, let's say, 3 years before, being considered for a promotion. But who does that negatively impact? Well, typically younger generations, they don't submit to that. They're like, I should be promoted based on my talent. And so, okay, what's the happy medium that's there when we're looking at um, your promotional policies? So those are some examples of, let's look at your policies. Let's see how implementing that can better improve the experience of all people in an equitable manner. But now we're looking at practices. And so when we're looking at practices, that's when we're talking about behavior and looking at how some of these policies are rolled out equally and equitably, as well as looking at leaders to say, all right, let's start peeling back some of those unconscious biases. Let's see why this person is your go-to person. Let's see why you're hiring these people. I'm seeing a trend here. I'm seeing a trend on what's on your team. So again, starting with that data, but then allowing that data to show you where the behavioral analysis need to happen to improve, again, the lived experience and the leadership quality of those individuals. But did I answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's helpful to that's helpful to understand. There's probably so many more examples of that, but
Yeah.
I do like the delineation between like the policies and the practices because breaking it down into systems like that really helps. And there's so many different types of practices, right? I remember at one point we were talking about just how you give feedback because you can have unconscious biases where you're giving different races, different types of background, and that's based on your own unconscious bias. Or oftentimes in organizations, there's talk about fitting into a specific type of culture. Like this is the culture we have, and it's sink or swim. And that fails to take into consideration, is this just a white patriarchal culture? And how do you have those conversations and dissect it in a way that doesn't just immediately get people to have their walls up, right? Like, how do we have some of those tough conversations? And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. Like, what are some ways that you've seen help people lower some of those walls to hear multiple perspectives?
Yeah. So I can tell you, I am retained the most for feedback
Yeah.
and to look at when we talk about specific processes, interview processes,
Mm,
and then promotional processes. Those
yeah.
those two, because that creates the largest gap in experiences. And so one way that people are typically a little bit more open is one, I lead with data. So I'm looking, okay, let's look at all the interviews you've had and let's see how many converted. And let's see who was a part of this conversation when it did convert and why. And I'm always looking at demographics because, again, each identity holds its own lived experience. So I am also aggregating that data based on demographics. And I'm saying, okay, this is what the numbers are saying. Let's
Yeah.
start with that. And then let's add some context to it because I often feel what the person has to say, even if they are at fault, even if they are that hiring manager that's always hiring middle-aged white men, right?
Yeah.
Like you still have something to say and you still have a
Yeah.
reason, but that reason also has an unconscious bias attached to it. So that is one way, starting with the data, but also understanding the why behind it.
Yeah.
And once I understand the why, then it's really about asking very intentional questions.
Yeah.
So I believe in like the coaching method where people kind of come to their conclusion on their own.
Yeah.
So that's some of the ways where I disarm people. And typically, if I'm there, they know what I'm there for. So I'll ask questions like, may I offer feedback right now?
Yeah.
Are you open to this? I've observed how you gave feedback. Can I give you another perspective, or can I provide some cultural competence here, some cultural perspective here? And typically that prepares the brain to say, okay, I'm about to get feedback, so you're not caught off guard.
Yeah. I love that approach. And I think helping others get to the conclusion is important work, but very specialized. So kudos to you. That can be a tough thing. So I can only imagine. I can only imagine.
And it's also about knowing like you might not get to the conclusion in that first conversation.
Yeah.
So it's not
Economic
about
work.
me, right? It's about them and their journey. And my success is not based on, do they get the point? Do they see my
Yeah.
point right now? My success is based on their evolution. And little by little, we'll get them to the point of being more inclusive,
Yeah.
whatever that means for that organization.
Yeah, I think it's such an important element that you're touching on because the goal is really to create more shared understanding, right? It's not forcing any one perspective down the other's throat, but it's about having more of that growth mindset, which I think the best leaders out there do. They're constantly questioning, how could we do this better? What are we doing well? And to have that type of mindset, I imagine, is what leads to incredible outcomes. But I was going to ask you, based on the different types of organizations you work with and the varying stakeholders that you are involved with, do you tend to see certain patterns or trends with folks or like personas who really like get it right or are the most kind of open to making these changes? Like who's doing it successfully and what are those like patterns that you notice?
So, as far as who's doing it successfully, you have companies like Accenture who's doing a fantastic job, companies like Target doing a fantastic job. You have companies here in the South like Georgia Power doing a fantastic job, right? So, you have these companies that are doing the work and they've been doing the work before it became popular in 2020.
Yeah, that's really important.
But I would say, that the profile of someone who's typically a bit more open is someone who's humble
Yeah.
and honest. And what I mean by honest is they're willing to have hard conversations. And they might get defensive in those conversations, but we can call that out as well. So someone who's humble enough to know I don't have all the answers, and I'm doing a really good job with one part of the business. There's other parts where I need some help, right? And that's where I come in. But also to have those honest conversations, because like we talked about, even during an interview process and someone being the first at an organization, whether it's the first gay person, first Black person, first woman, whatever, in a leadership position, like how do you prepare them for that? And remember, we talked about, be honest, like if this was a date, like how would you
Yeah.
have that conversation,
Yeah.
right?
So true.
So having a leader and having a person that is ready to be honest, to say, okay, yeah, I noticed this feeling, I noticed this response, I noticed this might be a bias for me, and I'm willing to be curious to
Yeah.
dig a little deeper. I would say, yeah, it would be those three things: openness, curiosity, and honesty.
I love that. And that reminds me, like, you can have that at whatever level you're at. Like,
Absolutely.
I've seen it with like someone who has 2 years of experience, 7 years C-suite. Like I really think it exists at so many levels, which brings me to like the next point that what I've seen and what I think is most effective is there's levels of accountability across the board. Maybe you're lucky and you have someone on the C-suite or multiple C-suite leaders who are like, this is a priority, we want to invest. But I think sometimes we forget that hiring managers or emerging leaders have a voice, and it's important to express that, especially if this is important to you or if you're seeing gaps in your workplace. Could you talk a little bit about some of the ways our listeners could lean into individual accountability at varying stages, depending on where they're at in their career?
Yeah, I think you can create a metric for almost anything. So I am a huge proponent of the 12-week year. Not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's in an entrepreneurial operating system by Brian Moran, and they create goals, but quarterly.
Yeah.
And so they look at 12 weeks as if it's 12 months. So why am I saying that? That's for someone at any level. And so if you are interested in creating a more inclusive workplace environment, then create a metric around it and have everyone really buy into what that metric is, have everyone's input into what that metric can be to really showcase improvement. Because ultimately, regardless of race, religion, sex, creed, any of those things, people want to feel successful in their role. They want to win. And so I think that is how you can really create not only accountability, but buy-in. So if you're a supervisor and you notice there's an experience on your team that you don't like, or you're noticing an issue with attendance, or you're noticing an issue with turnover, like create a metric around that. You
Yeah.
don't need to get permission for that. And then have everyone understand their role, their individual contribution to what that metric is. Because now you're getting buy-in from every single person and they know whether it's a whirlwind of a day or not, what am I doing to impact this overall goal? So I come at it from a very strategic approach where we're saying, here's the accountability, it's the metric, it's the meetings, it's the follow-up, it's the buy-in, and then here are your actions that you need to actually do to make it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so many ways that it can be done. And I've noticed that when you're earlier on in your career, you're so focused typically on just building your career up, right? And so when that happens, I think we sometimes tell ourselves like we shouldn't ask for help. And what I want to encourage everyone to do, regardless of what level you're at, is to have more of those conversations. Because when I look at some of the different experiences I've had, I look back and think there's so many more things I could have done. Like I could have checked in, but when, especially in middle management, you're like trying to manage your team, you're trying to manage up. And in hindsight now, I'm like, I could have just done a simple check-in with someone that was different from me and ask them, how they're doing, because I've just noticed that at earlier stages in their career, they're not as comfortable doing that. And so that's something I really want more people to do.
So you just made me think of two things. One, understanding what your superpower is and
Yeah.
really doubling down on that. So who are you and what about you is exceptional? And
Yeah.
then knowing that superpower and bringing that to the table, regardless of where you are in your career, you're there for a reason. And so really leveraging yourself as a resource, as well as check-ins are so important and we don't do them enough. So, the annual evaluation, some companies don't even do that anymore
No.
because it's based on those regular check-ins. And if you can do that and provide aggregated information to a higher up that's going to help them make a specific decision better or
Yeah.
give them more competitive advantage or give them
Yeah.
insights that they didn't necessarily have, even in the beginning of your career, you're positioning yourself as a resource, you're engaging and you're inspiring, and as a result you're also helping people as well as yourself.
Totally. It's a great way to bring your superpower to the table and have maybe departments that you're not typically working with better understand
Yes.
what you bring to the table. There was a really great example actually where someone that was more junior, she was a female on the direct sales team, came to me and was just venting about how there was a new hire on her team that she was probably going to have to manage, and he was another white male on the sales team. And what she expressed to me was that during that whole interview panel, like there was not a single woman that the candidates were talking to. So she was just kind of expressing this frustration to me. in my dream world, I'm like, girl, you go straight to HR and say something, right? But I realized like I was comfortable for her to come to. I had more seniority and clout probably. I immediately went to HR, didn't mention her name, and just said, hey, I'm curious to understand why there isn't greater diversity on the hiring committee if we're looking to hire different people for the direct sales team. And what I will say, I was really impressed with overnight, they changed that policy. And so I think that just shows the power of like different people coming together within a team. Like your voice does matter. Maybe, different organizations are different, but I was really impressed to see overnight, not only for that department, it became an HR policy across the board to have mixed representation as a part of the hiring committee. So sometimes I think it's easy to kind of get down on things or say that's not my problem or there's no likelihood of change. But if you don't try, you'll never get there.
Oh
So
my gosh, culture is not a you thing. It's
yeah,
a we thing. It's a us thing. Like each person at an organization impacts the culture. And if I was there like coaching that girl, I would say, you know what? Do you feel like you have an act for seeing gaps and seeing things that are missing, right? And if that's the case, that's your superpower. So in
yeah,
every meeting, who else should be here? Whose
yeah,
voice should be heard? Who's missing? Because in any decision-making group, there should be people that represent the impacted parties there. And
yeah,
everyone doesn't think that way. And
yeah.
so presenting yourself as this is my working style, this is how I process information, that's when we really get into the diversity of thought. I often think it's how we present it, but we got to also know ourselves and know what we're bringing to the table. But good for you for like speaking up and getting some change
Yeah, it's tough stuff.
done.
I'm a little bit of a bulldozer sometimes. So I'm like, what's happening? How do we, that's a little bit of my style. So, but I do think
Mhm.
it's an important example because I've just noticed sometimes people will just rather, they don't want to take it on because it can be, these are daunting things, and it is more comfortable to just focus on you and your problems in your world. And I just don't think that that is benefiting the greater good. Um, how do you sustain your passion and resilience? And what strategies would you recommend for others in the field?
So I know we talked a lot about like gender and race, but this is also huge for younger people in the organization. And so you might be a 20 something year old saying, what can I bring to the table? Or why would someone in a higher level role listen to me? But you have the perspective of your generation. And so
Yeah.
you can leverage that because generational differences are huge in the workplace right now. So how can you utilize your generational youth to help inform decisions, right? Not one person represents an entire subgroup, but you can definitely help provide perspective. So, going to your question of how do I keep myself just engaged and keep my passion going for this work? So I will say personally, I do the journaling, the therapy, the reading of books, and all the things, right? But my why is much bigger than myself. I look at the numbers and I say, what's my part? And so even when focusing on like race and culture, which is something I specialize in, I'm looking at the numbers and I'm like, okay, I don't have the expertise to impact healthcare. I don't have the expertise to impact the educational system. I am not going to always impact the financial system or all the other disparities that specifically exist here in the United States. But I can make one impact, and that is in someone's experience in the workplace. And so I look at it as if I can create a workplace that is more inclusive and more equitable, then more people have an opportunity to get promoted, to get equally paid, to get increase within that organization, get the development and all of those other things. And from that, it improves their financial well-being. It improves the legacy that they can leave for their children. It improves how they come home at night, right? Because we bring work home with us,
Yeah.
stresses and all. And so if I can improve that one piece, then me being frustrated with one person doesn't matter as much because it's so much bigger than me and how I feel. And so that is really my anchor. This is my one piece that I can do to make the world or the United States or someone's lived experiences a better place. So that overall vision, as well as doing the things for myself to just keep me going.
See, this is why you're living your purpose. Just like hearing you
Thank
talk, and like it's so
you.
funny because it's so true. Like I look at it's crazy. Like I see like that is what everyone should aspire to, like with whatever their dream career is. Like I think for me, it's so funny. Like for so long, this is why I had a moment after like a decade in tech where I was like, what am I doing? Like, do I care about this? Like, yes, I am so good at connecting with people. I love working with some of these incredible brands and being on like the cutting edge of technology. But at some point, I took a step back and was like, what are my strengths? What are my superpowers? And what am I willing to lose sleep over? And when I started to see so many young women of like different backgrounds, different colors coming to me with issues that I was dealing with at a young age, I was like, oh no, like we're pivoting here. Like I'm taking these skills, and I think it's so important to really live and honor your purpose. So that's why you're so,
Yeah.
because
Yeah. No,
that's
thank
where it comes
you.
naturally. You're like, I will do whatever it takes because this means something to me. And
Yeah, this is my
very
piece.
powerful.
You can look at everything in the world and be like, oh my God, I can't make a difference in this. Like things are so bad. You can look at it like that. Or you
Yeah.
can say, yeah, there are a lot of bad things, and this is my one way. Just one. This is my way of impacting it. And that comes differently for each person. For me, my son was my inspiration. I'm like, uh-oh, I gotta
Yeah.
make some changes. I got a baby now, right? But
Yeah.
everyone's inspiration is different, their motivation is different. But as long as you're doing something that is meaningful to you.
Yeah. I love that so much. It's so important. Um, let's talk a little bit about more of the strategy and implementation elements. I remember at one point when we were chatting about inclusion, you had mentioned that it's best for the DEI leader to report directly into the C-suite. Can you talk a little bit about why that's important?
Yeah, so right now, if an organization still has a DEI department, right? Let's moment of silence for that.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, they often report into HR, but DEI is meant to be the oversight of HR, as well as DEI is not only for the people. DEI impacts the budget. DEI impacts legal. It impacts marketing and promotions, and how you portray yourself within the organization. So, like public affairs, all of that. So, we look at DEI as integrated into the entire strategic plan in the entire organization, then who best to manage that? And that would be someone in the C suite, like the CEO. Another thing is the entire reason HR was created was to create structures and systems for an organization, specifically in the industrial times. Well, guess who wasn't considered when these systems and processes were being created? Most marginalized identities. And so, what DEI is saying is, okay, I know these are the structures and systems in place for compliance reasons, for legal liability reasons, but oh, yeah, I'm going to show you this oversight and this additional perspective, and that is how we need to shift and change. How are you going to challenge your boss about things that need to shift and change, right? It's two
Yeah.
completely different motivations, which can overlap, but I have the opinion that the C suite, so the CEO in particular, should be the one to make those decisions because it's for the overall organization, not just for your one, as well as the resources. So if we look at a lot of these different companies that no longer have a CDO, which is the Chief Diversity Officer, oftentimes it's because of resources. And
Mm,
again, they're looking at the one person to make all this change. And I always ask, if this was a safety initiative, if this was we need to increase revenues, would it be the one person, or would it be everyone playing their role in impacting the one? So that is some of the structural aspects to how I think. I also believe in looking at how people gain access to opportunity. And so that is something structural because you're looking at what are my promotions processes, what are my development process, what are my networking, sponsorships, mentorships, all of those things. What are departments that are feeder systems into the C suite, right? Like all of that. What are those structures that we need to now look at and see if there are areas to make it more equitable? So it's looking at systems, but
yeah.
also looking at structure, who reports to whom and why.
I love that observation because it's just not something I had thought about before. And when you mentioned that, yeah, inclusion really like legal, I'm just thinking of the legal department in itself. Like there's so many considerations where those two would need to work together. Where marketing and inclusion, like there really is a way to apply the lens to multiple functions. And when you think about it too, it's like over time, businesses operate based on who their clients are. The clients look different. You know what I mean? So, like, I've been in certain rooms, and usually I am the only woman of color on the sales team. And there is just like an immediate, more so of a bond that happens with me and whoever is
Absolutely.
in the room that's non white, right? And so you have to think about the fact that decision makers are changing. And to your point earlier on, some of the intergenerational differences, that's been a fascinating one to me because I think that the women who have, or, different diverse groups that have paved the way for generations to come, like they had to play a certain character and fit a certain mold that was probably really challenging just to get into senior positions now. And those people have paved the way for more diversity to come through the ranks. And I think what we're seeing now, and I'm curious what your take is there's more of a level of comfort now. Like I'm noticing it behind closed doors all the time with women of Black women, Indian women, Asian women, and even white women who are saying, like, yeah, there's an issue here. And we actually feel confident and comfortable talking about it because there is a level of like safety and ability to do that. But I think sometimes there's still that disconnect you see at the top because different groups feel like, well, I had to work this hard. It was this challenging for me. And even like there's so much data on like women on women crime within like organizations. I've seen non-white women who feel like they have to abide by the like white patriarchal ways because that is the only way they were going to rise through the ranks. So to kind of be like, oh, we've got to consider different ways of thinking seems to be tough intergenerationally. Have you seen that as well?
Yeah, this is why I don't believe in culture fit. This is why I believe in culture add, because culture fit is just saying we want someone who can fit into what we've already got going on. And culture add is saying, what can this person add to our organization, which is a different lens, a different perspective. But yeah, I've seen this, especially when talking about promotions, um, career pathways, especially when we talk about development and sponsorship and mentorships. Like once we get into that, that's when I really start to hear like, well, I've been here 10 years and I had to fight my way and I had to, no one told me there was a promotion up. I had to ask or to continue to sell myself and all of these things. But then, I will often challenge that with, do you know who else this impacts? Because what if you're from a culture that it's not looked at as positive to constantly sell yourself? Or what if
Yeah.
you're looked at as from a culture that you have to be more humble and more observant, right? Or you're more introverted. Like the workplace is created for extroverts. So that again is created with other people in mind. And so
Yeah.
what are some of the systems that would have helped you progress a little easier? And so I'll start there. Yes, you made it and you are a complete badass, right? But what would have helped? And what did you want in those moments? And we start to brainstorm on what that could have been. And now looking at it as, okay, what could be an option or a possibility now. And it's really just breaking through that I did it, you have to do it. Now, some people will never change, and that's understandable. But again, like you said, the market share is changing, decision makers are changing. So if you want to stay up with the times and you want to be relevant and cutting edge, yeah, you got to listen to some of this. and
Totally. I mean, yeah. I was gonna say, I feel like it's something I just believe truly deep down. Like it's like Blockbuster and Netflix to me. Like if you don't understand and you do not adapt, the next generation who is like very comfortable being themselves, like they're more authentic, they're gonna go to the places that support them and feel inclusive. And you will be missing out on so much talent if you are not willing to take a look in the mirror and see what's actually happening. So,
Forbes did a study on that. So 70 to 80% of Gen Z care and ask about your DEI initiatives. So
Hmm.
right now that might not seem like a big deal, but as we know, this fight for talent is cyclical. As we start to fight for talent again, that's going to be huge. And so where's your top talent going? Are they going to places that are more flexible with work schedules? Are they going to places with more inclusive benefits? Are they going to places that have a more inclusive workplace environment? These are questions they're asking in the interview. You are
Yeah.
now being interviewed just as much as you're interviewing them. And so, what do you want? Where do you want your top talent to go? And who do you want to be described as in the workplace? Because your company has a reputation. You have different Facebook groups, you have different blogs out there that's talking about these lived experiences, and your people are your biggest advocates. You can't pay for better marketing than the people that work for you, right? So,
Yeah.
what are you creating for them to say? What's the narrative you want them to tell? And it starts with all of the structural work and the inner work that we've been talking about.
Totally, totally. I think that makes perfect sense. And when you look at, I mean, we won't go too much into it, but when we're looking at the current state of DEI, I mean, it's fascinating because to your point, diversity means so many different things. I think whoever wants to see it with a negative connotation and run with it, like they're going to do that regardless. But there's so many studies, there's so much research that shows different ways of thinking, like creative problem solving. Like diversity means so much to your point, like introverts and extroverts. Like how do you create spaces that support just different needs? What are your predictions for the future of DEI in the workplace? And how do you recommend organizations prepare for those changes?
Yeah, I think the name is going to evolve, but the work is going to stay the same.
Okay.
And here is what further convicts me. So I am a certified EEOC investigator. Settlements and filings have increased this year.
Yeah.
It's this year, right? And for last year. And so what does that mean? That means there's a dollar amount tied to your behavior because a lot of these filings of discrimination have preventative behaviors that could have happened, something like feedback, something like interview processes, something like promotional processes, something like practices, and all of those things. That's what these filings are about. So, what can we do to prevent that? That is liability, that's legal. When we think about ISO, so ISO is like OSHA has different designations for organizations. OSHA is the oldest employee law. Psychological safety is not one of them. Think about that.
Yeah.
You can get designated on how your organization ranks with psychological safety. I never thought I would see it. That's the same as like safety. That's just regular safety, right? And
Oh
so
my
when we
God.
think about this, the name may change, but if you care about your profit margins, if you care about turnover, if you care about basket size or market share, then yeah, you don't have a choice but to care about inclusion, because diversity, equity, inclusion is really, what is your workplace culture?
Yeah.
How do people feel in your organization? I feel like it gets demonized a bit because when we think about diversity, like you said, we just think about race, but race is really the bottleneck here in the United States. So if you can really focus on the lived experiences of the lowest experience in your organization, then it's automatically going to lift the average when we're just looking at it from a pure numerical perspective. So yeah, the work's gonna stay the same for sure, regardless of what you call it. So DEI will not DIE. Okay.
Yes, okay. I think people need to hear that. Like I really do because there's so much fear mongering. And I think it takes like a certain level of like just have security within yourself, know who you are. Like there's only so much that each one of us can control. But I do think that those like micro impacts add up and there is a massive sense of hopefulness there. So
Look, in 2011, Pew
yeah.
Research showed that there were more Black and brown babies, or just say diverse babies, so brown
Yeah.
babies
Yeah.
born
Yeah.
than ever before. So
Yeah.
if we think about that, in 2011, they're going to enter the workplace probably in another 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
So now we literally, just from a numerical perspective, have more diversity in every stretch of the imagination in the workplace. You don't have a choice.
Yeah.
your systems have to change to represent who the makeup of the world is.
Yeah.
Same goes for disabilities and all of those things. So that's why the impacted parties need to be at the proverbial table when brainstorming and making these decisions. So yeah, the work's not going to stop.
Yeah, the work's not going to stop. I love it. That gives me complete hope. I'm so happy to
Yeah.
hear that. Well, as we wrap up, do you have any final actionable pieces of advice or steps that our listeners can take immediately to evaluate or improve DEI in their workplaces?
Yes. So I think you can, one, do your inner work. And we hear so much about the inner work, but one of the
So
easiest ways to do it is, what group makes you the most uncomfortable? And ask yourself why, and start doing the inner work there, because typically there are biases that are underlining that why, and you might be managing or working with that why, that talent, that subgroup. So start there. That's number one. Number two, if you are in a workplace, specifically if you are a leader, look to see who's speaking up in meetings, who's not, who's my go-to person, who's not, who's constantly being invited to different opportunities, who's not, and ask yourself why, and ask yourself who else should be here. It doesn't have to be the five who else, it can be the one who else. But if each one of us do that, then we are creating more space for more voices and more perspectives to be considered.
I love that. That's so great. And those are very like
Very
easy to
actionable.
remember, actionable. Yeah. It's funny, like you hear it. I feel like you hear it every now and then, but like I really want that to sink in with people because
Yes.
it's important. It's just important. Once you start doing it, I think other people notice it as well.
Yes.
And it's something that has to be an active, ongoing process. It is not a one and done by any.
No, nope. And it's not a zero sum game. So me focusing on women doesn't mean I don't like men. Me focusing on Gen Z does not mean we don't care about boomers, or it can go on and on. Look at it as our focus is going to enhance everyone. It's similar to the curb cut, right? That was created for people with a disability, for people on crutches or wheelchairs. But think about it now. The curb cut is something moms use, people with shopping carts use, parents use for strollers. Like, focusing on the one focuses on the all. It is not a zero sum game.
I love that. Abundance mindset.
Yes.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. If
Absolutely.
anyone's not already following Ama, follow her at that_inclusion lady for more
Yes.
tips. So thank
Thank
you.
you so much.